Anyways, guys, I'd like to tell you a story today about my days in minor hockey, because I've learned very quickly that here in Caledonia, you guys appreciate hockey, and I really respect that. So I figured I couldn't go wrong by starting off my first message with a story about hockey. Now, minor hockey in Erin was a big thing as well. Minor hockey was kind of part of the community. We were a small town, but we had a big heart for hockey. And so because of our size, though, we often only had a few teams in house league. So the thing was, very quickly, much like a playoff series in the NHL, you would develop rivalries against other teams. And even more than this, specifically, you would develop rivalries against other players. Yes. For me, there was one guy who often we butted heads. I didn't like him, he didn't like me. He was my age, so we always played together, but he was always on a different team. So every year he'd play center, I would play D, and we would just kind of bump heads in the corner. And so often he was a bit of a dirty player. He would trip me, slash me. One time specifically, I remember he two-handed me across the head with his stick, and the ref didn't call it. I know, I'm mad too. So, I'm just kidding. But I always remember my good old dad telling me, don't retaliate. Don't take a dumb penalty, it'll just cost you, it'll cost the team. So every time he would do something, that anger would flare up, but I would remember, don't take the penalty, don't take the penalty. Eventually, though, this all came to a head one game, in our last game together ever. There was 4 seconds left on the clock. They had just shot it in. We were up 3-2, so they're getting kind of dirty. And he ended up cross-checking my defensive partner down to the ice. And he kept going at him, so I grabbed him and threw him on the wall because he was hurting my D partner. And so I remember in that moment just these thoughts kind of rushing to my mind because I was just holding them. He was smaller than me. Man, I was stronger, and I had a reason. I could justify it. Anybody asked, if I wanted to do something, I could just say I was defending my D partner. It was the end of the year, and I couldn't be suspended. If I took a penalty, it wasn't going to affect the game. He had given me so much crap over the years, and I just started to raise my fist. This was it. Every part of my body was like, do it. But let's pause. Let's pause. Have you ever been in a position like this? Maybe for you it wasn't quite as dramatic, right? Maybe for you it's somebody here at Gateway, or it's at work, or it's at home, but there's people in your life that bring you to the end of your patience. And it's not socially acceptable to throw a punch. It's not socially acceptable to throw a punch, let's be clear. But maybe you've had that desire, right? And you can't throw a punch again, but you can throw an insult. Or you can be petty at the right moment, or you can get bitter, or you can distance yourself wherever possible. You can get back in some way. There are avenues, and you know what? You deserve it in some sense. You feel like that, right? We have all these people in our lives who rub us the wrong ways, and oftentimes our annoyance and our anger with them in some sense is justified because these are people that we are living with who have character deficiencies, right? Something that is consistent in them that is broken, right? That comes out against us. And see, our series this past month and a bit has been about growing godly character. And today I want to continue on with this series by touching on the idea and the question of how should we deal with another's lack of character? Or better yet, how does Jesus ask us to deal with another's lack of character? And to this, guys, I want to put forward this. As the main idea. The lack of character in others can actually be an opportunity for you to grow in your own godly character. And to explore this idea and what Jesus has to say on the topic, I want to actually take a look at Matthew 18, 21 to 35, because here we see Peter kind of asking a question that we've been dealing with. So follow along as I read this. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything, right? The servant's master took pity on him. He canceled his debt and he let him go. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and he began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, be patient with me, I'll pay it back. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had this man thrown into prison until he could pay his debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. "You wicked servant," he said. "I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?" In anger, his master handed them over to the jailers to be tortured until he could pay back all he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. So to begin with, we see Peter asking a question, right? How many times should I forgive somebody, Jesus? See, Peter is dealing with what we're talking about here. He's not talking about a one-off situation. He's talking about somebody who is routinely offending him, somebody who has a character issue. And his question is, well, how many times do I forgive him? How many strikes are we playing with? And Peter seems to actually answer his own question. 7? It seems kind of like an odd number, but it's actually super generous for Peter to say something like that. You see, in Peter's day, there was actually a bit of a 3-strike rule that kind of the culture adopted. If someone sinned against you once, you forgive them, right? We do that all the time. Someone sins against you twice, probably a mistake, we forgive them again. Third time, that's a pattern. And at that point, you might be encouraged to distance yourself from that person. So Peter's offer of 7, well, that was very, very generous. And I mean, like, if you look at the math, it's kind of funny. It kind of seems like Peter took the cultural standard, he doubled it by 2, and then for good measure, because he was speaking to Jesus Christ, like he added 1. Like, this is what he was looking at, right? It's the equivalent of somebody saying, here are 2 Tim's gift cards and a coupon for a donut, instead of like our usual conventional singular Tim's gift card. It was very, very generous. Jesus' answer then was even more surprising, because Peter's was very surprising. He takes Peter's answer and he says, 7 times, Peter? No, 77 times. Or maybe in the translation you're reading, it says 70 times 7. Whatever you prefer. It's kind of ambiguous, the exact number that Jesus was trying to get at, but that's not the point anyways. What Jesus is saying here is that if you're counting, you've missed the point. Yeah, Jesus didn't actually mean forgive people 77 times or 490 or some crazy number. It's not reasonable. Nobody keeps count like that. He means forgive them unconditionally. To those who routinely offend you, those who continually try your patience, those who they themselves have a character deficiency, yeah, Jesus asks you to forgive them unconditionally. As many times as it takes, actually. Now, really briefly, I want to make clear what Jesus is saying and what he isn't saying. So let's go over quickly what forgiveness is not. Forgiving someone doesn't justify the situation. All I mean there is that forgiving someone doesn't make what they did right. It doesn't, that's all a justification means, right? That's all I'm talking about here. It's not okay. You don't have to think it's okay what they did. Forgiveness is also not reconciliation. Reconciliation should be sought when possible. Coming back into unity or right relation with somebody, that should always be sought out. But there are situations where that's not possible and when that's not right. If someone has abused you, physically, emotionally, sexually, and they're unrepentant of that action, then you should not pursue reconciliation. If you're going to put yourself back into harm's way, you don't have to reconcile with that person. Forgiveness is not necessarily putting yourself back into harm's way. But what Jesus is calling us to is unconditional forgiveness. That is the releasing and the letting go of a situation and the negative emotions you might hold towards a person or a situation. It's recognizing something is so broken and so messed up that you refuse to be a part of that situation anymore. Right? What that person has done is so messed up that you break yourself from even the thoughts and the emotions and the anger that's a part of it. And you do this again and again and again, according to Jesus. Now, you might say, Wes, look, that's all fine and great on a theoretical level. But you don't know what I'm dealing with. No, you don't know what this person does to me. If you did, if Jesus knew how bad it was, then I promise you, you guys wouldn't ask him to forgive them. And I get it. I think oftentimes we romanticize forgiveness. Right? Especially we as Christians. We tend to see things at the end of the story, right? After forgiveness has transpired, at the happily ever after, and we tend to ignore how hard it is to get there. I have a friend, and for the sake of privacy, we'll call her Sarah. Sarah's story is a tough one. She grew up in a house of an abusive father. You know, not all of us get to have great fathers on Father's Day that we're proud of. She told me, and she learned this at a much later age, but that actually began when she was only a few months old. Yeah, you see, in her own father's words, he would smack her when she started to act and cry. You know, like the one thing that a baby can do to try to get attention? That's when he would hit her. And as she grew up, this pattern of abuse continued. He would often hit her routinely in places where it was easily covered, as that usually goes. Her mother, who knew about it, continued on in this relationship because she just desired to keep the family together. So she became an enabler. And it wasn't until she was 18 that she finally left and kind of got free. And to this day, on top of that, her father still refuses to accept any fault for the action. As she still routinely gets calls and messages from her father attempting to justify his actions, saying that it takes two for stuff like this, insinuating that it's partly her fault that he, the father, would beat his child. What do you do in a situation like this? Right, the people in Sarah's life who she was supposed to be able to trust the most have broken that trust in one of the worst ways possible. What do? How is Sarah supposed to forgive them? Now, maybe your story isn't quite as heavy as Sarah's. I don't know if it is. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I don't know. But I'm sure on some level you have felt a hurt or a pain. Somebody has wronged you to the extent where forgiveness has just seemed out of the question. Right? Like, I don't want forgiveness in this situation, but even if I did, I don't know how I'd get there. Well, Jesus' parable actually deals with this because I'm sure the disciples and the people around at the time actually had the same thoughts. What Jesus said was radical, right? So let's take a look at the story. So the servant in the story here, the first one, is described as owing the king an overwhelmingly enormous amount of money. Jesus uses the term 10,000 talents. That's a specific term to describe what was owed. If you want to break that down, a talent in Jesus' day was worth about 6,000 denarii. And in a workday, the average person would pull in a single denarius, the singular version of denarii. So let's break the math down. If the worker owes 10,000 talents, then the server is going to have to work approximately 60 million days. That's not that bad. In a work year of 310 days, that would work out to be 193,000 years of work. Yeah, not the best. On top of this, 10,000 was literally the highest counting unit that you could use in Jesus' day for finances. So the number isn't supposed to be fathomable, right? It's the equivalent of Jesus saying, and the servant owed the king $1 gazillion, right? He's exaggerating. Jesus isn't trying to tell Peter about a specific really big sum. He's purposefully exaggerating. It's a size of debt that is unpayable. The servant will never be able to repay the king what he owes. It's supposed to be seen as so large that it's, in effect, unforgivable. And that's what makes the king's response so amazing. Right? He forgives the unforgivable. He drops the need for repayment. He demonstrates an undeserved and unconditional grace to the servant. Right? He doesn't offer the servant a bargain. It's not as if the servant can, make enough money and then get to a certain point and he'll cut out the rest. No. It is unconditional. There's nothing that the servant did to deserve the grace. There's nothing that he could do to deserve it. It was simply given to him. Now the story continues on. And the servant, after receiving this forgiveness, goes on to have the same interaction with the roles reversed, right? The second servant who owed him 100 denarii, which, again, that's no insignificant amount with what we just said, right? He owes him 100 days' work, 3 months' wages. That's a lump sum. But what happens is the first servant mercilessly chokes the second servant, right? Because of his inability to repay the sum. And at this, the king hears about it, and he tosses the first servant, who he had just forgiven, into prison. And he cites the servant's inability to forgive the person who owed him the tiny sum in comparison to the astronomical debt that was just paid for him. Does this sound familiar to you? If you haven't put together who's who yet, the king is actually meant to represent God here. And the servant who is forgiven, it's you and me. Yeah, we've been pardoned from death and separation from God, a sum we could never repay. We've been given the ultimate demonstration of unconditional grace from God. We've been ransomed to God through Christ. Our lives themselves have been purchased and redeemed unconditionally through Jesus' death on the cross. Forgiveness for the unforgivable has been freely given to us. And in light of that forgiveness, God is calling us to forgive just as unconditionally. You see, our forgiveness has to be worked out through an appreciation of the grace that has been given to us from God. Yeah, we have to not only receive God's grace in our lives, we have to let it affect and transform us. Yeah, if grace has come into your life, it's not enough that it just sits idly by and you enjoy the benefits. It should change something in your life, right? As forgiveness flows into you, it should be poured out of you as well. And so the debt that Christ paid, it's meant to be seen as so large and so grand and so unimaginable that any slight against you in life, no matter how horrible, how painful, and how awful, it's meant to be seen as minuscule in comparison. And this isn't to downplay what's happened in your life. It's not. Whatever offense has occurred to you at the hands of others, it probably was terrible. And you're right. I'm young. Maybe I don't know how bad it is. Maybe I don't. But I can tell you I do know a thing or two about grace. And that whatever we're all going through, whatever pain we've experienced at the hands of others, it doesn't hold a candle to what Christ experienced on the cross. You see, the grace of Christ, it changes the question in regards to forgiveness. In light of Christ's work on the cross, the question isn't, how could I forgive? The question is, how could I not forgive? The wickedness of the servant wasn't his choking, it wasn't his anger. Those were part of the problem, for sure. But the king calls the servant wicked for the obvious lack of transformation grace has had in his life. He failed to let the grace of the king impact him. That was the offense. How could he not offer forgiveness to the man in front of him, given what had just transpired? And so in this way, Gateway, a character deficiency in another's life is an opportunity to demonstrate the work of God's grace in our lives, to demonstrate our godly character, what we've been talking about for this past month and a bit. When I was in grade 11, I had a consistent mentor, and I've talked about him a few times. His name was Dave, and so Dave was an excellent youth leader. He was a great example to my friend Matt and I, and every week on Tuesday mornings, he would pick Matt and I up at about 6 a.m. So we could meet before school for us and work for him. Dave didn't have to do this. This was his choice, but he decided it was a very important thing for him to do. And so Dave routinely, for the better part of a few years, would pick us up on Tuesday. Now again, let me emphasize the time, 6 a.m. Young adult Wes sucks at getting up. Teenager Wes was far worse, okay? And on one particular morning, I actually slept in altogether, and I missed the morning. The thing was, circumstantially, Matt slept in too. So that day, when I woke up at 7:30, I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but I woke up feeling like too rested. You know what I mean? Like you feel like guilty with how good you feel because you knew going to bed the night before you weren't supposed to wake up feeling good. And so you wake up and you're like, oh, I feel way too good. Shoot. Turn over, 7:30, 15 texts from Dave. Dang. So I call Matt, and I'm like, Matt, did you guys meet? And he's like, no, man, I thought you guys met. So now we're both freaking out at this point. We're like, dang. Our mentor, the guy who's giving us his time and his morning, he just been hung out to dry by the both of us. So we both call him, and we sorely apologize, right? We're citing how awful we've been, how embarrassed we were, and obviously we weren't expecting him to, drop the hammer, you know what I mean? This was kind of a small thing, but we were expecting the word. You know, the one word that you hate more than anything to come from somebody you love, the D word, disappointed. Yeah, the word is the worst. Parents, let me tell you, some of you, if you have a teenager or a child, you might be at the age where you've forgotten what it feels like to hear that word. I promise you, if the line, I'm not upset, I'm just disappointed, comes out, it will hurt. It hits hard. And so for an example, fathers, today is your day. If at any point today, your family tries to guilt you into doing work at some point, right? The kids or your wife are like, we should do yard work today. Do not get angry. Do not show any emotion. You look them right in the eye and you say, look, I'm not upset that you'd ask me to do that today on Father's Day. I'm just disappointed. And you won't lift the finger for the rest of the day. I promise you. But I mean, we were dreading Dave saying this. We really didn't want to hear it. And so finally, Dave, he quieted us down. And he said something we didn't really expect. He said, look, guys, It's all good. I did the same with my mentor, which was actually the pastor at the time. He said, I blew it one morning. I slept in, I forgot about the date, and we had planned this for months. And he was super gracious with me, and he forgave me. And guys, I want to do the same with you. Don't worry about it. And that may sound like a really small thing, right? It's not really a big deal, and I get that, but Dave got it, right? Or he was shown grace in his circumstance in life, and in the same way, he showed grace to my circumstance. Yeah, he was modeling out exactly what Jesus was talking about. He wasn't just accepting grace, but he was living it out. And as small as him saying that was, in the moment, it was so freeing, and it has stuck with me since. Now, the situations you're dealing with, I'm sure, are much, much bigger than this. But the same principle still stands. God has shown you unconditional grace in your situation for your sin and your offense to him. So how then can you not respond with grace to another's offense to you? Right? Like my mentor, Dave, if you've experienced grace in your life in any way, how can you not apply that to situations in your own life? And after all this, again, you might be saying, Wes, I get it. I get the concept, the principle, and it sounds really good, but it's just not realistic. So thanks, but no thanks. Or maybe it's not that explicit. You're sitting here right now, this sounds really good. You're like, yeah, forgiveness, that's great. But I mean, deep down in your heart, like, you know you're not going to go home and do anything. Like, you have something in your mind. Somebody's been coming to your mind this whole time, but you're not going to do anything about it. And maybe that's subconscious. Maybe you're not consciously thinking about it. But maybe that's you. And if that's you, that's fine. You're allowed to do that. If that's you today, though, I need to warn you. I need to let you know that to every action, there's a consequence. And that if you choose not to forgive somebody, there are repercussions. If we continue on with Jesus' parable, we see the servant isn't just scolded. Yeah, he's kind of dealt with. The king tosses him in prison, and he receives punishment for his actions. He commands that the servant is to be tortured until he can repay off his debts. Those debts, remember that we said that he would never be able to repay off? Yeah, those ones. And then in response to all this, Jesus adds on to the end in verse 35 that this is how God will treat anyone who is found unforgiving in their own lives. It's a scary thing when I read. When I read it, yeah, I don't know. So what does Jesus mean, though? Because that's whenever I've read this, it would make me uncomfortable, and I'd always try to break it down. What does he really mean? Well, at the end of the parable, I do think he's hinting towards eternity. Yeah, Jesus is hitting at the idea that unforgiveness or forgiveness in this life can translate into the next. The unforgiveness you show now will in turn be shown to you. Let me be clear, though. Here's what he doesn't mean. I want to be very clear on this. We believe in salvation through grace here at Gateway. That's very clear. And I think the parable speaks to that, right? There's nothing the servant could have done to deserve the king's debts. Nothing. And like the servant, there's nothing you could do to deserve God's love. There's nothing you can do to deserve God's grace. Nothing. There's no amount of forgiveness that you could offer that would make God see you as impressive or make God offer you forgiveness, right? It's a free gift that's given to us. But as we talked about earlier, your ability to forgive can be an indication of your understanding and receiving of grace in your life. So a pattern of unforgiveness in your life can be a demonstration of a lack of grace. And grace, as we discussed earlier, should have a transforming effect on your life. Now, again, let me be clear. When I say a pattern of forgiveness, I'm not necessarily talking about cases where it's really hard to forgive. Forgiving someone can be a long and hard process. My friend Sarah had forgiven her mother for being the enabler in this situation. But she's told me that there are days when she gets angry and bitter, and she has to constantly go back and remind herself she's forgiven her mom. If there is a case in your life where it's genuinely difficult to forgive somebody and you are trying your best and sometimes you have bad days and you hold anger and resentment and bitter towards a person or a situation on those days, but you are trying to get over that, that's okay. This is not what Jesus is talking about. Let me be very, very clear. Please do not think that's what Jesus is talking about. What he is talking about is a pattern of unforgiveness. A routine refusal to forgive others in your life, a constant anger and bitterness towards others. This can be a sign of a lack of grace in your life. And if that's the case, let me tell you, there are eternal implications. But here's the thing. I don't think those consequences of unforgiveness are just in the future. No. There are some other major implications in the here and now too. And I think this is part of the reason why Jesus talks about this parable, why he brings it up. There are real consequences to unforgiveness in your life today. Right? We talk about hell like it's a place of fire and brimstone, and then heaven like it's some ethereal, cloudy castle. And I want to say eternity, a large part of it is just an amplification and a continuation of what we find ourselves here in the present. And that's a whole other topic, and I'm not here to argue with you on that, but hear me out. If you let grace into your life, in some sense, you're already participating in what's to come in heaven. If unconditional forgiveness is what you live out of, if you let grace permeate your life, then you're already participating in the freedom that God has for you in some way. You're just waiting for the celebration of it. But conversely, if you let your life be defined by unforgiveness and bitterness, you're already participating in separation from God. If you routinely and actively refuse to forgive and you yourself never accept the forgiveness offered to you by God, you'll find yourself in your own prison of bitterness and anger. We talk about hell like it's a prison of its own, and it is. It's a separation from God. But if you let unforgiveness seep into your life, you're in prison before you get there. Right? Hell's just the continuation of that. Unforgiveness is a prison then and now. In this way, too, unforgiveness will affect the way you experience life. If you let unforgiveness bind you, it'll restrict you. You cannot do the work of God out of a place of bitterness and anger. You can't. Your ability to love and demonstrate compassion to others will be hindered if you hold on to hurts. Conversely, though, if you let God's unconditional grace transform your life, it will have an effect on you for the better. Letting a pattern of forgiveness define your life will have a lasting impact and will open you up to the work of God. To illustrate this, I want to bring up a story from a few years back. Approximately 12 years ago, in a small Amish community known as Nickel Mines, many of you have probably heard of it, a man named Charles Roberts entered into the town's one-room schoolhouse. He was armed with a 9mm pistol. He ordered the children in the room to barricade the door, but right before he did, he let the males out and he let one pregnant lady out. Right after that, they kind of ran out and they got some help, and very quickly, a hostage situation was ongoing in the tiny Amish community. Over the PA system, the police repeatedly tried to implore Roberts to let the kids go and to drop his weapons. But at 11:07, Roberts opened fire on the 10 little girls left between the ages of 6 to 13. He hit 8 of them. 5 of them would die afterwards. After shooting those girls, Roberts turned the pistol towards himself, and he left behind a set of parents, a widowed wife, and 3 fatherless children. In a community this small, there wasn't a single person who wasn't affected. Everybody lost someone that day. A daughter, a sister, a friend, a father. And this event obviously gained media attention. There's no question, it was a huge thing, but what you might not know is that the aftermath garnered a bigger following. Yeah, see, immediately after the shooting, the Amish community actually came around the Roberts family. Not an hour afterwards, the neighbors of the Roberts family who were there, they rushed over to the house. And on the day of the shooting, one of the grandfathers of the murdered girls was recorded saying, "We must not think evil of this man." A member of the Brethren community next door to the Amish community, in his evaluation of Nickel Mines, said, "I don't think there's anybody here that wants to do anything but forgive. And not only reach out to those who have suffered a loss in the way, but to reach out to the family of the man who committed these acts." You see, the community of Nickel Mines, in response to this unimaginable tragedy, they offered forgiveness and compassion to the family that was left behind. This community wouldn't leave them alone. It was recorded that a few of the men from the community, they held Robert's father for an hour as he sobbed after the events. The next day, a community charity was established, and people of Amish descent often do not accept charity or even form groups to do this, but they did for them. And over 30 members of the community, which is a good portion of the town's population, they showed up to Charles' funeral. And his widow, on top of that, was even invited to some of the funerals of the little girls. In response to all this, Charles' widow, she wrote a letter to the community thanking them for the grace and the love and the forgiveness demonstrated. One of the lines reads as follows: "Your love for our family has helped to provide the healing we so desperately need. Gifts you have given have touched our hearts in a way no words can describe. Your compassion has reached beyond our family, beyond our community, and is changing our world, and for this we sincerely thank you." The radical love demonstrated by the community to the Roberts family was not possible without forgiveness. If there ever was a time when anger was valid, if there ever was a time when bitterness and anger and hate and rage were allowed to prevail, it should have been this. But if there was ever a time that compassion and love were necessary, it was also this. If there was ever a time when a community needed to come around a family, it was this. And the only thing that could facilitate this, the only thing that makes this possible, is forgiveness. Unconditional, undeserved forgiveness. This unconditional forgiveness allowed the love of God to minister to a family in the midst of unimaginable brokenness. So let me reiterate again. If grace has entered your life, it will be radically transformational. A life of forgiveness should mark the life of those who have been forgiven, no matter the degree of offense, no matter the quantity of offense, no matter the pain involved. We are called to offer unconditional forgiveness to those around us. The character flaws in another person are an opportunity to demonstrate the grace God has already given us. Character deficiencies, big and small, from the unimaginable to the minor hockey fights, they're all opportunities to demonstrate grace to others through forgiveness. It's a time for you to demonstrate your own character, like we've been talking about. At the end of the day, if you're wondering, I never threw the fist. I let him go. He didn't deserve it. No, I'm kidding. And I don't know if that ever had an impact on him. I really don't. I'm pretty sure it didn't, and I'm pretty sure the guy still doesn't like me. But that's not the point, right? We're called to forgive unconditionally. At times, like with the Amish community, they're going to deeply appreciate that, and it's going to change lives. And at times, like with my hockey friend, it's not going to do anything. That doesn't matter, right? Because while we were sinners, Christ died for us. And to those who still live in that sin, Christ still died for them. And so in our daily lives, as we come across those who offend us, as we come across people who in some way lack in character, we are called to forgive unconditionally. We are called to demonstrate the grace we've received from God in the lives of others. So at this point, I'm going to invite the worship team and the prayer teams up. If at any point during the sermon you felt convicted in any way, you felt there's a situation or a person in my life where I have been unforgiving, I pray that this would be an opportunity for you to actually talk to God about this and to ask Him to begin to break into your life through the Spirit so that you can offer forgiveness to that situation and that person. At the same time, if it's something that is deep and the bitterness runs deep, I'd ask that you come up to the prayer teams when they're up here so that they have an opportunity to pray for you. As well, if you ever have any other needs or desires or anything like that, please come up to the prayer team as well. But at this point, let's pray. Dear God, thank you for this day. Thank you for Father's Day. God, thank you for the amazing men that you've placed in our lives, God. And I guess right now, God, we just confess that sometimes there are people across the table who aren't amazing, like so many of the fathers here, God. They're broken people with character deficiencies, God. They have their issues, God. I pray that you would give us power through your Spirit, God, to respond in forgiveness to them. God, acknowledging the grace that you've given us, acknowledging what you did was so amazing and so awesome, so unconditional, God, that we just have to respond in our own lives, God. Father, as we continue to worship, I pray that you would continue to prod at us through your Spirit. You would direct us if there are people or situations that we've buried, God, and we don't want to dig up. I pray that you, through your Spirit, would dig that up and then continue to help us to begin the path towards forgiveness, God. Lord, we love you. We thank you. And please be with us as we continue to worship. In your Son's name, amen.